Welcome to our session on BI+ archives and history. We are going to kick things off with a presentation from Charlotte Claydon. And Charlotte is a new researcher currently studying at Goldsmiths on the MA Performance and Culture course. She also works as the Access and Participation Coordinator at BIMM University, Bristol, and this work feeds into her research. Her research focuses on equity, diversity, and inclusion issues and policy and how these interact with performing arts. So Charlotte, I will hand things over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to do that annoying Zoom thing where I just share my screen. Can everyone see the slides okay? Is that all coming up okay there? Well, thank you everyone so much for being here. Really do appreciate it. So in this presentation, I'll be giving you a snapshot into some analysis I have conducted into the oppression of marginalized groups within society. My aim is to consider the question of whether when we talk about society, we must consider questions of power. And I've opted to look at this from the viewpoint of one particular dominated group, the queer community. But the findings can be used to understand the processes of oppression, which can then be linked to other marginalized groups' experiences of society. I feel it's important to start with a note on language. So when using the term queer or queer community, I'm referring to the LGBTQ+ community. I appreciate that some people don't like this term, but it resonates kind of with my own identity and is also a word really synonymous with academic discourse around our community. Many of the researchers I have used in this study use the term homosexuality. So for the purposes of this study, I will use the terms queer and homosexuality interchangeably. And I'll also utilize the term dominated interchangeably with the terms marginalized and oppressed. And just also to say as well, this talk might be triggering for some people as I will be discussing oppression, medicalization, and the AIDS crisis. So I won't be offended if you need to leave at any point. So before we get into the analysis, I want to briefly outline some key concepts of Pierre Bourdieu's, which make up the basis of this study. Bourdieu is a sociologist, and he looked at social life as metaphorical fields, which make up the basis of all life within our society. Our habitus is our background, how we are conditioned to perceive and interact with the fields of which we are a part. We see an expansion of these concepts in Bourdieu's book, The State Nobility, where he explains how this can work in the fields of education and power, and he also outlines the field of power. Now, Bourdieu explains that the field of power is a place in which those of the dominant positions utilize strategies to ensure that they remain in this position within the field and therefore in society. One of the ways that this can be done is through symbolic violence. Now, Bourdieu believed that, particularly in our increasingly globalized society, violence came in more sophisticated ways than literal violence and brutality. He is quoted as saying, "Through the concept of symbolic violence, I tried to make visible an unperceived form of everyday violence." And it is this symbolic violence which allows the dominant groups to continue to marginalize dominated groups. And I believe that a good example of this is how queerness has been associated with illness. So the term homosexuality first began to be used in medical discourse in 1869 and was adopted into popular discourse around the late 1880s to early 1890s. And this term came about from a bubbling of debate, notation, and classification from prominent psychologists of the time, including Freud. Now, psychologists, it would seem, were keen to establish a clear categorization in order to discover, amongst other things, whether queerness was a natural phenomenon or whether it could be cured. Now, current researchers on the topic of medical homosexuality have stated that medicine determines and is determined by social attitudes. And indeed, this medicalization led to additional laws against acts of homosexuality. Although something I find quite interesting was that whilst there were pushes for these laws to extend to female acts of homosexuality, at least in the UK, it never happened because there were concerns that knowledge of these laws would actually encourage homosexual behavior in women. The diagnostic term homosexuality was removed from a diagnosis as a psychiatric disorder from the American Psychiatry Association in 1973, yet it was not until 1992 that the 10th edition of the International Classification of Diseases officially removed the term as a diagnosis. Therefore, up until recently, and I'm saying this as a 90s baby myself, homosexuality was still a psychiatric diagnosis for international psychiatrists and psychologists. Now, if we link this into kind of Bourdieu's framework, then even with the removal of its diagnostic terminology, our culture's structure or habitus was set up to consider queerness as something to be cured, as the majority of the population at the time would have been primed to believe this through the ideology previously set. Furthermore, considering this within the field of power, medicalization of the queer community and history of illegality will have meant the queer community held a dominated position within this field, enacted upon them by lawmakers and the medical community. And this status quo would need to be maintained and was maintained during the 1980s with the rise of the AIDS crisis. The first documented outbreak of the AIDS crisis was reported in 1981. And this was during the period from when it was still waiting removal from international classification as a psychiatric illness. And with the rise of the AIDS crisis, society now had an illness of the body to associate with the queer community. In her essay, Illness as Metaphor, Sontag discusses bodily diseases and states that the melodramatics of the disease metaphor in modern political discourse assumes a punitive notion of the disease not as a punishment, but as a sign of evil, something to be punished. And this can be seen in the ways in which AIDS was discussed in the media during the crisis. So I'm now going to show you, and I hope this works, as I have tested it before, I'm going to show you one of the public health TV campaigns which were shown during the AIDS crisis. So as you can see, this video features John Hurt's booming voice over the image of someone carving a tombstone, with the closing line, "If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you, so don't die of ignorance." This authoritarian voice, which reprimands the viewer, sets out to incite feelings of fear and the disease as something to be punished by a higher authority. We can also identify another way symbolic violence was enacted in the statement that so far it's only been confined to small groups, but it's spreading. The small groups in this instance would be the queer community, particularly gay and bisexual men. And whilst not explicitly stated in this public health campaign, it is implied who is at fault for their ignorance in spreading this virus. Sontag talks in her essays about the term risk group, and these phrases as a neutral-sounding bureaucratic category, which also revives the archaic idea of a tainted community that illness is judged. I believe the term small groups in this context has a similar effect. The final tagline, "Don't die of ignorance," was the main slogan for this campaign, with the wording found in tube stations and posted through letterboxes. This slogan suggests that it's the fault of the individual if they contract and die of AIDS, as it implies that it is one's own unawareness which is causing their death. This implication simplifies the overall societal issue of why AIDS was prevalent in the queer community, including the lack of sufficient sex education, particularly safe sex education, and the lack of role models and representation. In the world of performing arts, we see a discourse in how the symbolic violence affected the queer community. So Tony Kushner's seminal play, Angels in America, within its 2-act, 7-hour runtime, explores issues relating to queerness and the AIDS crisis, and provides an interesting study into these discourses, particularly in the character of Roy Conan. Beware, spoilers ahead for the show if you've not seen it. At the start of the play, Roy is introduced as a corrupt but powerful lawyer who clearly holds a large amount of economic, cultural, and social capital within the field of the play, or metaphorically within society. In Roy's first scene, he is in a meeting with an employee, Joe, and is too busy working to really focus on the lowly employee in his office. This power is unspoken until Roy is given his AIDS diagnosis, and from this scene onwards, we see his position slowly decline within the field of power. Roy refuses for the doctor to diagnose him with AIDS or to tell him that he is homosexual because of what he believes the label denotes. Roy, in this instance, feels he cannot be labeled as such because he holds a dominant position within the field of power, whereas the queer community does not. In part 2, Perestroika, we see that Roy has been admitted to hospital and eventually he dies, but not before his vision of a previous client, Ethel Rosenberg, tells him that he has been disbarred from being a lawyer. It is interesting that Roy dies in the same scene where he hears this news. At this point, it is clear to the audience that he will die soon, and the addition of the loss of his career, which is the reason for his high volume of economic, social, and cultural capital, shows that this disease has not only caused him to lose his life, but his position within the field of power to which he identified himself. Thus, he dies in a dominated rather than in a dominant position. Ultimately, what we see through Roy's trajectory during the play links us again to Sontag, who said that to get AIDS is precisely to be revealed in the majority of cases so far as the member of a certain risk group, a community of pariahs. Roy slowly loses his capital volume from the moment of his diagnosis, and with it, his position within the field of power and his identity. Sadly, countercultural performances such as Angels in America during and about the HIV/AIDS crisis, whilst providing interesting discourse on the matter, were not able to eliminate the long-lasting effect of symbolic violence against the queer community. So how do these examples show us that in order to discuss society, we must consider questions of power? The examples of symbolic violence and domination used here did not and do not affect heterosexual individuals who are privileged from being aligned with the dominant group in this way. As such, they will not be subjected to the issues and concerns that the queer community are, and so can easily deny that these things are happening. Bourdieu explains this as misrecognition, which is described as functioning within a logic of denial. And ultimately, when they consider society, they do not have to consider questions of power, as these forms of symbolic violence and literal violence do not affect their day-to-day life. Dominated groups, on the other hand, must consider questions of power within their view of society, as symbolic violence and direct domination affect their lives. Whilst the example of queerness as illness, both psychologically and physically, is a historic one, we can see instances of this kind of symbolic violence happening now. The documentary Disclosure, for example, highlights the lack of an offensive transgender representation. Towns in Poland have declared themselves LGBT-free zones, and there are loopholes in laws banning conversion therapy in the UK.
Bon.
Thus, whether it's seen... Oh, sorry, was that a question?
Là, mon réflexe, c'est d'essayer de lui prouver que j'ai raison et qu'elle a tort, donc non.
I'll carry on, as I think that might be a voice on by accident. Thus, whether it is seeing themselves medicalized or shamed for a health crisis, or allowing for a lack of poor representation of their lives in mass media, dominated groups must consider questions of power within the society that they live. So thank you for listening. I appreciate that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of my analysis. I'll be happy to answer any questions, or if you're interested in reading the full study, please do contact me on the email provided. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Do we have any questions right now for Charlotte? Okay, so in the interest of time, we'll move on to our next presenter. Thank you, Charlotte. Jinx Vilhas and Inácio Saldanha. Jinx is a bisexual, white, non-binary master's student studying social anthropology at the University of Campinas in Brazil. They're a student researcher at the Center for Gender Studies at the university. Inácio is a bisexual, non-white, cis man of indigenous descent studying for a master's in social anthropology at the University of Campinas in Brazil. They are also a student researcher at the Center for Gender Studies at the university, as well as being a coordinator of Amazonian Studies group on bisexuality. Welcome to you both, and I will pass the floor over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. You can hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
So like Caroline introduced me, I'm Jinx Vilhas. I'm a 25-year-old non-binary white bisexual person. So I'm currently a master's student in social anthropology. And currently I'm writing my dissertation about the political career of a trans councilwoman from Minas Gerais, another Brazilian state that borders São Paulo. So in this research process, I have also established intersections with the more general theme of sexuality and violence, a phenomenon that appears in my case study. Together with Inácio, have been reflecting on the relations between sexuality and violence, especially in the case of LGBTI plus political leaders and elected politicians. Inácio is currently researching the emergence of the bisexual category in Belém, Pará, in the northern region of Brazil, between the 1980s and 1990s. In this sense, we present some preliminary reflections about the murder of Renildo José dos Santos, a Brazilian councilman in 1993 and its repercussions. Activist groups and non-governmental organizations such as the Gay Group of Bahia, the Gay Group of Alagoas in Brazil, Amnesty International, and different newspapers at the time reported and denounced Renildo's murder as a barbaric crime that shocked due to the degree of violence and cruelty used to perpetrate his death. The following account, taken from the website of the Gay Group of Alagoas by a National Geographic journalist, is strong, graphic, and may be especially disturbing to more sensitive people. So I'm warning you about this because I'm about to tell this. On the 20th of January 1993, Renildo, a city councillor for the district of Coqueiro Seco, it's a small city in the state of Alagoas in Brazil, publicly declared his sexual orientation in an interview with Radio Gazeta. His political foes accused him of lack of decency and suspended him from his political functions in the city council. Feeling threatened, he asked the police authorities for protection. Brazilian leaders of the gay movement tried to transfer him from Coqueiro Seco to the south of Brazil. At dawn of the 10th of March 1993, Renildo was kidnapped from his house. Taken to an unknown location, he was beaten up violently and his ears, nose, and tongue were mutilated. His fingernails were ripped out. Then his fingers were sheared off. His legs were broken. He was castrated, and a piece of wood was inserted into his anus and then broken while still inside. He was then shot in both eyes and both ears. His body was burned because his murderers wanted to make his identification impossible. Finally, as if all this was not enough, his head was cut off and thrown into a river. Body parts were found at a distance of about 170 kilometers from each other. Those responsible for Renildo's death were police officers. It was suspected that they were hired by local politicians to get rid of him. A hypothesis later confirmed. Renildo had been receiving death threats for some years due to his opposition to the mayor of the city. He had been sworn to death in 1989 by those who killed him precisely because of his opposition, and was beaten up a few times by them. In each case, he sought help from the state authorities without any response. When he exposed his sexuality on local radio, he also allegedly made reference to the sexuality of the mayor's son. Before the physical death, it was necessary to operate a political and moral death. Renildo was deposed from his position as councilman based on arguments of moral degradation and breach of decorum. And now I'm passing to Inácio, who will continue.
Hi, I'm taking from this point. Renildo's murder was politicized by the Gay Group of Bahia, a prominent group at the time. They projected him as a gay martyr, initially as a reference of the violence that the homosexual movement was common to call homophobia in Brazil, then reaching international repercussion with the Amnesty International report. In this context, he is referred to as a homosexual. It was a moment in which this category was used by part of the Brazilian movement as an umbrella, encompassing gays, lesbians, and transvestites, and bisexual people excluded from this list. Renewdo came to be referred to by activists and researchers in Brazil as an indicator of the violence that homosexual people suffered, particularly in the Brazilian context. The repercussion of the case led to contact with the international bisexual movement. The Australian Bisexual Network, created in 1997, the Renildo José dos Santos Memorial Award, also referring to Renildo as bi or gay. Bisexual activists from different parts of the world were awarded, such as the American Robin Knox in 1997, the Argentine Alejandra Sardá in 1998, and the American Lenny Kahumanu and the Bengali Suman Laihi in 1999. In contrast, in Brazil, there was no organized bisexual movement at the time, which only began to form in the mid-2000s. The construction of a memory of Renildo as a bisexual is still beginning to emerge and become evident as bisexuality matures as a political identity in Brazil. His name was cited in the Brazilian Bisexual Manifesto, drafted at the initiative of Brazilian Bisexual Front in 2021, alongside the name of the Councilwoman Marielle Franco, who was assassinated in 2018. The framing of Renildo's identities oscillates greatly depending on the perspective of the observers. One can say that it is defined according to the actors who are mobilizing it by constituting Renildo as a victim of political violence. As we have seen, the association of his name with bisexuality occurs according to the insertion of bisexuality in each political context. This is independent of how the victim precisely identified himself. That is, we did not have access to the recording of the radio program in which Renildo came out of the closet. Regardless, different versions circulate and have been appropriated by different institutional actors and activists, based on a shared memory of political violence. In a Brazil in which the category bisexual circulated negatively in the homosexual movement, Renildo posthumously became just gay or homosexual. In Brazil or Australia, in which segmented bisexual spaces already politicize this sexual orientation, it seems important that a victim of biphobic violence be recognized, and so Renildo's name emerges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we are open to questions.
Thank you very much for sharing that really important piece of not only Brazilian history, but bisexual history. Are there any questions for Inácio or Jinx? Okay, thank you both. And I will welcome our next speaker, Gabrielle Iaconetti, who is presenting on the politics of invisibility, locating bisexual communities in Ontario queer history from the 1980s to the 2000s. So Gabrielle is a second-year MA student in the Department of History at Concordia University. Her thesis research project is focused on bisexual communities and the experiences of bisexual activists in the Canadian gay liberation movement in the later 20th century. She holds a BA with a double major in history and classics from Concordia University and MIST from McGill University with a concentration in archival studies. So welcome, Gabrielle, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Teralyn. Okay, I'm going to share my screen really quickly for my presentation, if that's all right. So, can everybody see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. Also, just as like a side note, my camera has been super weird and glitchy, so if I freeze halfway through the presentation, I apologize for that. Okay, I'm also going the wrong way in my presentation. So thank you everybody for being here to hear my presentation on bi community histories in Ontario in the later 20th century. All of the information and the stories I'm going to be sharing with you here today are the bedrock for my master's thesis at Concordia University, where I'm in my second and final year of my master's. So queer Canadian history is very much lacking in research on bi community history, specifically with most of the scholarship focusing on gay and lesbian communities and their activism. So this is an attempt of mine to expand the historical record. So the research process is still very much ongoing, but I'm excited to share what I have with you today. So Ontario had and still has a very vibrant and active queer community with a lot of important groups and magazines and other literature focusing on gay liberation coming from this province from the late 1960s onwards. Bi organizations began forming in Ontario in the early 1980s, with more appearing in the decades following, much like with the groups that we've seen in the US in the same period. The appearance of these support groups focused on discussing bi issues, planning social events for building community, and also for promoting visibility in queer spaces that were too frequently dubbed as gay and lesbian only. It's important to note that there were mixed gender groups as well as women's and men's only groups. And I had the opportunity to speak with bi activists who were important presences in both of these types of spaces. Oral histories are also key to my research as archival sources that document the history of the bi community in Ontario are very difficult to come by. Also, on top of that, spoken testimonies have long been key to preserving queer community histories by capturing the experiences of those who were present in the community, as well as queer feelings and affect, which is also going to be an important component of my research. And just as like a tiny side note, just due to the time constraints and just the natural progression of doing this project and doing this presentation, I'm only going to be focusing on 3 groups that were based in Toronto, as opposed to like the entire province of Ontario, because then we'd be here for days. So I'm going to start off with the first group called Bikes. So this was a women's only bi group that was started in 1984 and then disbanded in the late 1980s. In the process of speaking to people who started these bi support groups, it became evident that there was a need not only for spaces where bi issues were discussed, but also feminist issues and issues on women's rights as well. So many bi women who went on to found and to facilitate these women's support groups came from various backgrounds and they had either been very involved in lesbian circles in the larger gay liberation movement, as well as sexual health education. I was fortunate to be able to get in contact with Jennifer Chambers, who was the founder of Bikes, and ask her about her experiences with forming a bi women's group in the 1980s. So there's a quote from Jennifer on the screen there, where she would talk about how she would go to events for gays and lesbians, and she would talk about being bi, and that people would like come up to her and say that was very brave of her, but to not tell anybody else that they were bi as well. So she thought that she would start a group since there was a lot of fear and a lot of feeling of disconnection from the gay and lesbian movement for people who were bi but were too afraid to speak about it. There was a need to have a space where bi women could be open about their sexuality and experiences, because there was a lot of fear and anxiety surrounding coming out as bi at this time. Also, Jennifer had been very involved in lesbian circles where there were negative attitudes towards bi women, and realized the importance of having a support group. Bikes was described by her as a safe space for bi women to talk about their issues. There was also a lot of support in coming out, and also just general socializing and trying to make friends and building a community in that sense. Jennifer was also involved in a lot of queer political activism and spoke on various panels at gay and lesbian events about bisexuality. So she was very, very vocal about it. So this is a quote from Jennifer about Pride, about how bi people weren't allowed to be in Pride marches in the early 1980s, and there were hardly any people there. There was hardly any presence. But then one of the members from Bikes was volunteering on the Pride the Pride Committee. So, and then she says it became very awkward to tell her at the end of the year, we don't like your kind. So they were allowed to march, which also goes to show the importance of having bi presences in queer spaces and asserting that identity. So next group I'm going to talk about is Bisexual Women of Toronto, or BIWOT. So this is a group that started in 1994 and still exists today. Throughout my oral history research, almost half of the people that I interviewed were involved in this group specifically, so 4 out of 9 people. Today, they still exist, like I said, and they hold a lot of brunches and other various social events for bi women. When they were just getting started in the 1990s, its mission was also very similar to other groups, was to have a space to discuss bi issues and also to talk about experiences amongst each other in regards specifically to being bi women. Dana Shaw, who is one of the most active facilitators and a very important member of the group in the 90s, describes it as a space that, aside from bi visibility and support, incorporated women's rights and choice, experience with abuse and harassment, the difficulties of flirting with women versus the difficulties of flirting with men, and trying to navigate the ambiguities between friendship and dating and things like that for bisexual women. According to Dana and Margaret Robinson, who was another important member of the group, an important factor of participation in this group was ensuring that members could show up at queer women's events together, and to be there or to go off on their own separate ways, but just to have people there who they felt like knew their experiences and could support them. And it was a way to kind of mitigate the feeling of being overwhelmed and feeling alone at queer women's events. So it was very, very supportive. So they would go to a lot of social events at queer bars and lesbian bars and other social spaces, and would just kind of be in those spaces together and feel comfortable knowing that there were people around who they could be themselves with. This is a quote from Margaret Robinson. Excuse me, I'm just gonna take a sip of water. So it was a kind of self-defense or organization to be able to come together and be able to discuss who we were and who we were becoming and what it meant to us in a room that didn't have a bunch of other people and their agendas. So we were trying to create and carve out space for ourselves in what was often a very unfriendly place. So that was Margaret Robinson speaking about BIWOT and the importance of having that group and that space for bisexual women. This is also a screenshot that I got from the Archives in Toronto. It's a pamphlet or a brochure from BIWOT that was made in the 90s. And so there's some information about the group on one side and the slogans on the other side, which I really like. So people would pick up this brochure and they would read about BIWOT and have these very affirming kind of slogans on it as well. So I enjoyed reading this a lot and I was really happy to find it. And finally, we have the Ontario/Toronto Bisexual Network, which was started in 1989. And it started off as the Ontario Bisexual Network, but it was later renamed the Toronto Bisexual Network, and that also still exists today. This was a mixed gender group that was also co-founded by Jennifer Chambers and a friend of hers, so a person from BIWOT. Mixed gender groups mostly concern themselves with issues of bi visibility and education on bi issues, both for people who were coming to terms with their identities, as well as larger gay and lesbian communities. So the appearance of Jennifer Chambers in this group as well shows how active bi people were in forming multiple groups, even though they might have been involved in other groups at the same time. Stephen Harvey, who is one of the folks that I interviewed, who was also very active in the Ontario Bi Network, recalled that the group had 2 main purposes. So one was to be a provincial voice for bi issues, and second, to be a place for networking in a number of cities, as there were many groups that were scattered across the province at this time. That didn't really pan out, unfortunately, which is why it was later named the Toronto Bisexual Network. They were also involved with larger queer activism that was happening in the province at this time, such as the fight for same-sex marriage and being in the die-ins that were in response to the AIDS crisis at this time. Inclusivity and bi visibility within the queer community, especially at events like the annual Pride Parade, were also integral to the mission of the Ontario Bisexual Network. So I mentioned the quote before with Jennifer about Pride. These groups were all very, very focused on Pride and being visible at Pride, since at the time they were not welcome, and people would give them thumbs down signals and would shout awful things at them at Pride when bi people tried to be visible. So a lot of the missions of these groups are very much centered around being visible at Pride, being proud at Pride. It's like a thing that came up in all the conversations that I had with people. So being visible at Pride was definitely an integral mission. So this is a quote from Stephen Harvey about the Ontario Bi Network, saying that for some people, it would feel as easy as breathing to come to their first meeting. For some other people, it would be a monumental task. And there will be people who would be so emotional that it was so profound to be in a space with others who see them as they are, that there would be tears. So I think this is a very, very powerful quote from Harvey, and really emphasizes the importance of having these groups for people who didn't feel like they belonged in the gay and lesbian community, and felt very, very validated in these spaces and very affirmed. So goes to show the importance of having this support. And this is a screenshot from a brochure from OBN about Bisexuality 101 that was offered during Pride Week in the 90s. And again, shows the importance of the presence of these groups at Pride for people who might not have had access to any other types of resources about being bi in any other context. So again, being visible at Pride was another important aspect of this. So to conclude, bi groups in Ontario appeared as early as the 1980s, but then they really picked up speed in the 90s and into the early 2000s. Mixed gender and single gender groups existed, which demonstrated the need both for larger community bonds, but also for gender specific issues within it. Building community, visibility, and education were pillars of activism and informed the operations of support groups at this time. So this research would not have been possible without the eagerness and the generosity of time that came from the people that I interviewed. So my biggest thanks goes out to them. And also oral history is incredibly important to queer historical practice. And this is especially true with the bi community, in order to situate them within the historical record, since oftentimes we can't really find anything else. So I'm really, really grateful to have the opportunity to speak with all these people. Thank you very much. And if you have any other questions about my research, please feel free to contact me at the email there, and I'd be happy to speak about it with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Gabrielle. Very interesting talk. I'm in Toronto, so I'm familiar with the Toronto Network and the Ontario, but
cool.
Yeah, great to learn about the history, something I certainly had not, I did not know that. So Luke in the chat, obviously great talk, and draws a parallel with the community structure in Minnesota and the general Midwest during the 80s and 2000s, and asks the question, what was it like as a researcher to experience the archive and then meet the individuals involved? And how did you, or do you, manage the affective components of that particular research methodology? And it seems like it's something that they're currently managing themselves.
Yes, thank you for the question, Luke. This is definitely something that I'm still working towards myself. What was it like as a researcher to experience the archive? I actually haven't had the chance to go in person to the archive, so the stuff that I have is very limited since it's on like the digital platform. So I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to go in person and to and to interact with all of the materials. But speaking to these individuals was incredibly powerful, very affirming. Like I had read about some of them in news articles, and to be able to speak with them felt like a very, very powerful experience. So managing the affective components is also still something that I'm working on. So we can chat about that further if you'd like. I don't know. It's a good question that I don't have like a concrete answer to, but we could definitely speak about it. It's a process that's ongoing for sure, but we can chat about it more if you'd like, if you would like to contact me. But I'm really interested in your research as well. It sounds great. So thank you for the question. Oh,
great, thank you. Another question, yeah. So have you had to interact with non-bi archives in your research and were met with bi erasure there? And if so, how did you manage that?
Yeah, so I have been reading some magazines in the archive. So there's the Body Politic, which I'm sure you know about, Tara Lynn, which was a magazine that was published until like I think the late 1980s of gay liberation. And it's funny because there's like a whole section like on ads and like the classifieds and stuff at the end where there would be a lot of bi people in like the classifieds being like, I'm looking for friends or like a relationship, like, you know, stuff like that. But in the articles that were published in the magazine, there was never a single mention of like bi people anywhere, except for maybe when talking like about the AIDS crisis being like gay and bisexual men, like, you know, be careful type thing. But never any like, you know, about like the support groups or like anything like that. But there was clearly a presence of bi people reading the body politics since they were in the classifieds. So that's pretty much like the biggest form of erasure that like I've seen. Like I'm sure the people who made the magazine read the classifieds and were like, oh, there are bi people that are reading this, but we're not reporting on any of their activities or anything. So that's the thing that I've had the most. Up until now, I've mostly just been focusing on the interviews, and I'm going to be doing like the physical, like archival research soon. But so far, that's the biggest thing that like has stood out to me in terms of bi erasure in the archive, in terms of like gay liberation materials and stuff. So thank you for the question. Thank you for letting me reflect on that.
One more question.
Sure.
So feel that the previous communities have fed into the current bi community or influenced the current bi community in Ontario?
Another really good question that I don't have a super concrete answer to. I think that they really mostly helped in like showing that it was possible to like form these bi groups because a lot of the people that formed the groups were just like, I'm tired of not being seen. I'm tired of not having a space where like I feel validated and I feel supported. And so they just said, my solution is I'm just going to start a group. And they did that. So I think that just having like the courage to start those groups and also a lot of the people who were there and like actually starting the group, so like Stephen Harvey, like Dana, they're all still very involved in the communities now. So I think like also having like that level of like cross-generational kind of like queer relationships and like having these people who were there at the beginning still being involved today probably has like a massive influence, and like having these really great presences in the groups now probably has had like a really, really great effect on the operations of the group, on the groups that are still currently in activities. So like by Women of Toronto and the Toronto Bisexual Network still has those presences there. So I think that that's probably a big factor in influence for sure. Thank you for the question, Charlotte.
Thank you again, Gabrielle. And
thank you very much.
Absolutely. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Matteo Albanese. Their pronouns are they, them. And their talk is Towards a Bisexual Archive, Elements of a Bisexual History. So Matteo is a European master's student in gender studies and a militant activist in the Italian bisexual movement. They're passionate about queer theory and historiography and believe the cultural struggle to be an essential part of the political struggle. They organized the last Italian National Bisexual Rally and founded the first Italian National Bisexual Conference, Bisexual. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry for the name that is very hard to pronounce for Anglophone speakers.
It is. Even with the pronunciation guide, I appreciate that.
We'll think about next time, maybe something in English. No, joking aside. So, okay, let me just do the awkward thing of doing, sharing the screen. Okay, so welcome everyone. Do you see my screen? Just checking.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, perfect. So welcome everyone. This is the presentation that I'm doing today, talking about the establishment of a bisexual archive, an independent bisexual archive in Italy this year. And in the case of some people may not know it, this cover is just it's a parody of the last edition of Elements of Homosexual Critique by Mario Mieli. So I'm just taking credits where it's done. Mieli is an influence also because the archive is named after him. So it was just a reference to it. So, okay, let's get started with the talk. First, the erasure of non-heterosexuality in history is a pervasive phenomenon. An explicit example of such erasure of queerness can be found in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. As these societies regulate sexuality on other matters beyond gender, they were unfamiliar with the concepts of homophobia and biphobia. And thus we have a lot of references to queer behavior and attraction in these ancient histories, but these stories are hidden from contemporary tellings. The relationship between Achilles and Patroclus, for example, has been historically reduced to a platonic friendship despite classical interpretations. We are told again and again about Julius Caesar's relationship with King Cleopatra of Egypt, but not with King Nicomedes of Bithynia. In Italian high schools, only a specific selection of Tibullus and Catullus poems are studied in Latin literature classes. Those dedicated to women, respectively Delia and Lesbia, and not those dedicated to men, respectively Maratus and Juventius. The Stanford scholar Kenji Yoshino, in their 2000 paper, The Epistemic Contract of Bisexual Erasure, theorizes how non-heterosexual invisibility is that is derived from the taboo against Achillean and Sapphic desires is only the second cause of bisexual invisibility. The first cause is invisibility of sexuality itself because of society's stigma against sex, while the third one is bisexual invisibility because of his bisexuality, so only attacking bisexuality based on the heterosexual homosexual binary. Bisexual system in the past thus is not a sample from this erasure. The monosexist system constructs a memory of the past as monosexual, that is heterosexual or homosexual, with the intent of negating the distinct, whole, and stable existence of attraction to more than one gender throughout history. Julius Caesar, Tibullus, Catullus that we mentioned are such examples of bisexual erasure in Italian heterosexual society. But bisexual erasure is not only a heterosexual prerogative. Yoshino cites the case of the 1994 book, The Apparitional Lesbian, by lesbian theorist Terry Castle as an example of bisexual erasure from gay and lesbian individuals. Here, Castle describes Greta Garbo, a bisexual woman, as a lesbian actress, despite recognizing that the latter occasionally had affairs with men as well as women, because, according to the author, while Garbo sometimes makes love to men, she would rather make love to women. We have a similar example in Italy. Singer-songwriter Gianna Nannini is an example of such erasure by Italian gay and lesbian culture, where she's accused of being a lesbian in the closet, despite having come out as a bisexual woman in 1995, and repeatedly coming out again and again in the following decades. Even in the retelling of history of bisexuality, even in the retelling of queer history, sexuality is hardly visible. This is the case of the 2017 miniseries When We Rise, where bisexual people are nowhere to be found. This absence is caused by erasure and not a lack of presence. Bisexual people worked shoulder to shoulder with the gay and lesbian activists whose lives are featured in When We Rise, and were among the people that revolted against oppression. Okay. A similar case has happened in the retelling of the story of Mario Mieli, one of Italy's most important queer activists, who is often described as a gay man, even though, paraphrasing his own words, he loved women and he slept with them also. So what happened is, so this is the part about bisexual history, talking about the need for a bisexual archive. In the 1970s, gay and lesbian activists founded the first homosexual archive, because they recognized the erasure of homosexuality in the past was a part of their oppression. The same decade marked the emergence of archives specifically dedicated to preserving lesbian history, in contrast to the gay-dominated archives, where it would not have been a priority. Bisexual history, together with transgender history, finds itself in a marginal position relative to gay and lesbian history. Recognizing the need for historical preservation, given bisexual existence threefold vulnerability to erasure, this year marked the establishment of an independent bisexual archive in Italy, the Bisexual Archive Mario Mieli. This archive focused on preserving cultural productions in Italian, not exclusively, but mostly. The vast majority of the bisexual movement in Italy is composed of grassroots and informal groups, rendering historical material decentralized and unevenly preserved compared to the formally established gay and lesbian associations in Italy, and thus further requiring a specific institution to collect and centralize such productions. Bisexual history requires an independent archive organization, has historical productions by queer people, and often fallen outside what is considered properly archived by some institution, as for example, in the cases of leaflets, newspapers, books, banners, clothing, photos, and videos. We have a case in Italy, in some parts of Italy, of bisexual graffiti by a group of activists, in which they are reclaiming visibility through the urban landscape, which present their own issues in preservation. Through the current scholarship on graffiti archiving and more broadly street art archiving, the Bisexual Archive is attempting a project of secondary collection and preservation, so that is of photos, etc., in the context and contextualizing them in the geography of the place. The prominence of bisexual region in history has presented a challenge in the establishment of the Bisexual Archive collecting scope, marked by a contrast between the completism of the archive and the physical limitation of the institution. Should the archive collect all biographies written in Italian about a bisexual individual? Should the archive collect biographies that explicitly describe a bisexual individual as a heterosexual or homosexual? The decisions are currently made on a case-to-case basis, taking into consideration the unique nature or lack thereof of the cultural production and the role played by this production in society. For example, Gianna Nannini biography Cazzi Miei was considered important for preservation, given that its publication in 2017 sparked a public backlash by some parts of the gay and lesbian community, including some high-profile activists, who shamed Nannini for having taken so much time to come out as a lesbian, even though by 2017 she already came out as a bisexual woman multiple times. Thus, given the unprecedented nature of a bisexual archive in Italy, the process, sorry, I'm getting a bit mumbly. The project represents an uncharted territory that has created some theoretical and logistical issues. On the other hand, this marginalization in itself is the reason to progress in the establishment and sustainment of this institution. Bisexual existence in itself and the memory of bisexual existence in the past constitutes a radical act of resistance against a monosexist society that wants bisexuality invisible, fragmented, and temporary. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Matteo. We'll open it up to our audience for questions. One of the things that I remarked about all of the presentations is that it's a really interesting kind of culmination of themes that are still really persistent and relevant today. So biphobia, violence, erasure, persistence, endurance. Really interesting to see that come through everyone's presentations. Okay, we'll give it a few more seconds for questions. And if there are no questions for Matteo, thank you very much for your presentation. That was terrific. And thank you to all of our presenters today. We look forward to seeing you in one of our upcoming sessions. Oh, and we have one question from Julian. So how will the archival materials be acquired and found?
So there's a bit of an issue because obviously the archive is quite new. So mostly what we're doing is going to antiquary books and attempting some donation inquiries to the community, in particular with the copies of gay and lesbian magazines in Italy, in which some of them are important for bisexual history. For example, Gianna Nannini that we mentioned came out on a page for the first time in the pages of one gay newspaper. We're trying to find that number and access it. What we're doing to found the acquisitions mostly is through projects of self-financing, that is creation of fanzines, stickers, that kind of thing. That is a practice that is very common in northern Italy bisexual groups. And so we have fanzines about bisexual history and stickers of the archive. So this is the way that we attempt to make some money. We have a coffee which hasn't worked that much up to the moment, but we might keep working on it in the future. So in the case anyone is interested, we have it there. Are there any questions? No. I don't think so.
No other questions.
Perfect.
Thank you so much again to Matteo and all of our presenters today. Couple of comments in the chat and people are dropping their contact info, so make sure you check that out before the session closes, as the chat will not be available afterwards. Jinx says, Mario Mieli's writings arrived in Brazil in the 1980s and had some influence on the early days of the Brazilian homosexual movement. So wanting to follow this work and know more about it. So thank you again to everyone, and we will see you in our next keynote.